Sarah adjusted her burgundy sweater dress for the 10th time as she sat in James's car. The late November evening was settling in, and the streets of suburban Boston were already decorated for the upcoming holiday season. James drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. They were heading to his family's annual Thanksgiving dinner, an event Sarah had attended for the past 3 years of their relationship. "Your mom still making her famous apple pie?" Sarah asked, attempting to break the heavy silence that had become all too familiar between them lately. James merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The strain in their relationship had been building for months, ever since Sarah received her promotion at the marketing firm. What should have been a celebration had somehow become a point of contention. As they pulled into his parents' driveway, Sarah could see the warm glow of lights through the windows and shadows of people moving inside. The two-story colonial house looked exactly as it had during her first visit. Pristine white with dark green shutters and a wreath hanging on the front door. The sight used to fill her with comfort. Now it made her stomach clench with anxiety. "We're here," James announced unnecessarily, turning off the engine. "Try to." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Just try to keep things pleasant. It's Thanksgiving, after all." Sarah bit back a sharp reply. Of course she would be pleasant. She wasn't the one who had been passive-aggressive for weeks. Instead of voicing these thoughts, she forced a smile and got out of the car. The moment they stepped through the front door, the familiar scents of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread enveloped them. James's mother, Linda, rushed forward with open arms, her silver-streaked hair perfectly styled and her holiday apron spotless despite hours of cooking. "Sarah, honey, James, we were wondering when you'd arrive." Linda pulled them both into warm hugs. If she noticed the tension between them, she didn't show it. The house was already full of family members. James' older sister, Rebecca, was there with her husband, Tom, and their 2 children. His younger brother, Michael, had brought his new girlfriend, and his father, Robert, was in his usual spot in the living room armchair, watching football with several uncles. "Sarah, dear, you look lovely," Linda said, leading them toward the kitchen. "That promotion must be treating you well, though I imagine the travel must be difficult." The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah caught the quick glance between mother and son. "It's been manageable," Sarah replied diplomatically. "The company has been very supportive." James made a sound that might have been a scoff but covered it by coughing. "I'm going to say hi to Dad," he muttered, leaving Sarah alone with his mother. Linda busied herself with checking something in the oven while Sarah stood awkwardly in the kitchen. Through the doorway, she could see James greeting his father with a warm hug. Once upon a time, she had felt like she belonged in this house, with this family. Now she felt like an outsider looking in. "Would you like to help me with the cranberry sauce?" Linda offered, clearly trying to ease the discomfort. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself stirring sauce and making small talk about holiday recipes. She could hear laughter from the living room, where James was now playing with his niece and nephew. He was always good with kids. It was one of the things that had first attracted her to him. The doorbell rang again, announcing the arrival of more relatives. The house grew louder with greetings and conversations, the atmosphere becoming more festive. But for Sarah, each new arrival felt like another witness to the growing distance between her and James. Rebecca approached the kitchen, her youngest balanced on her hip. "Sarah, I've been meaning to call you about that marketing campaign you worked on. It was brilliant. I saw it featured in the business journal." Before Sarah could respond, James appeared in the doorway. "Yeah, it was great. Everyone at the office loved it so much they're sending her to Chicago next month. For 3 weeks this time." There it was, that tone, the one that suggested he was proud of her success while simultaneously resenting it. Sarah gripped the counter edge, feeling the familiar frustration rising. The cranberry sauce bubbled on the stove, forgotten as the tension in the kitchen rose several degrees. Linda, ever the peacekeeper, clapped her hands together. "Well, dinner's almost ready. Sarah, would you help me set the table?" As Sarah followed Linda to the dining room with a stack of plates, she couldn't shake the feeling that this Thanksgiving dinner was about to become memorable for all the wrong reasons. The large oak dining table was set perfectly, with Linda's best china and the fancy silverware she only used for special occasions. Sarah helped arrange the name cards, noticing that Linda had placed her next to James, as usual, but also strategically between Rebecca and Michael's new girlfriend, Amy. Throughout the meal's first course, Sarah tried to focus on her butternut squash soup while conversations flowed around her. Linda had outdone herself with the food, as always, but Sarah could barely taste it. She was too aware of James beside her, his shoulders stiff as he spoke with his uncle about work. "So, Sarah," James's father Robert called from the head of the table, "Linda tells me your company is expanding to international markets." His tone was friendly, genuinely interested. Sarah brightened slightly. "Yes, we just secured major contracts in London and Singapore. That's actually why I'll be traveling more next quarter. We're setting up new offices and—" "More traveling?" James interrupted, putting down his spoon with a little too much force. "You hadn't mentioned Singapore." The table grew quieter, other conversations dying down as family members sensed the tension. Sarah took a slow sip of water, buying time to control her response. "It just came up yesterday. I was going to tell you after the holiday." "Like you told me about Chicago. Last minute?" James's voice had that edge to it, the one that had been appearing more frequently lately. Linda quickly jumped in. "Rebecca, how is Tommy doing in his new school? First grade already." But the attempt at changing the subject fell flat as James continued. "You know, it would be nice to actually discuss these things before they're decided. Partners usually do that." Sarah felt her cheeks burning. She could feel everyone's eyes on them, particularly Amy, who was witnessing her first family drama as Michael's new girlfriend. "James, can we not do this here?" "Do what?" "Have a conversation about our relationship. That would be new." Rebecca cleared her throat. "Hey, remember that Thanksgiving when Michael set the turkey on fire trying to deep fry it?" Michael played along, laughing a bit too loudly. "That was classic. Dad was so mad." "I just think," James continued as if no one had spoken, "that when someone says they're committed to a relationship, they actually make time for it." Sarah's hand tightened around her water glass. The ice cubes clinked against the side, seeming unnaturally loud in the growing tension. She could see Linda's distress, Robert's discomfort, and the way the younger cousins were being quietly ushered to the kitchen by their parents. "I am committed," Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "My career doesn't change that." "Your career is all you talk about anymore, all you think about. When was the last time we had a real conversation that didn't involve your next meeting or your next trip?" "James," Linda intervened, her voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps this isn't the best time." "No, Mom, it's fine," James said, though his tone suggested it was anything but fine. "We're all family here, right? Sarah's been part of these dinners for 3 years. She should know by now that we discuss important things as a family." Sarah felt something snap inside her. 3 years of dinners, of trying to fit into this close-knit family while maintaining her own identity, of walking the line between career woman and potential future daughter-in-law. 3 years, and now James was using that very intimacy as a weapon. "You want to discuss important things?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Fine, let's discuss how you've turned every achievement of mine into a personal attack on you. Let's talk about how you were supportive of my career until it started doing better than yours." The silence around the table was deafening. Even the clink of silverware had stopped. Sarah could see Rebecca and Michael exchanging worried glances, while Linda seemed frozen in her chair. The tension in the dining room had reached its peak. The turkey sat forgotten, and even Linda had stopped trying to salvage the situation. Sarah could feel sweat forming on the back of her neck despite the room's comfortable temperature. James sat beside her, radiating anger and hurt in equal measure. "You know what?" James said, pushing his plate away slightly. "Maybe we should just tell everyone how you really feel about family commitments. About how you conveniently schedule business trips during every family event this year." Sarah's hands began to shake under the table. "That's not true. I was here for Easter and your father's birthday." "You left early for both," James cut in. "Always some work emergency, some client meeting that couldn't wait." Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Son, maybe we should." "No, Dad, she needs to hear this," James continued, turning to face Sarah fully. "You missed my sister's baby shower because of a critical presentation. You skipped Mom's garden party for a last-minute client meeting. And now you're planning to be gone for 3 weeks in Chicago, plus Singapore." The younger children had long since been led away to the living room, but their muffled laughter could be heard from the next room, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in the dining room. Sarah noticed Amy, Michael's girlfriend, staring intently at her plate, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Those weren't excuses, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. Those were real work commitments. Some of us actually have to work hard to build our careers. We can't all rely on family connections like you did. A collective intake of breath around the table. Everyone knew James had started at his father's firm, though he worked his way up on his own merit. James's face reddened. At least I understand the value of family. At least I'm not running away from every chance at real connection. Running away? Sarah laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Is that what you think I'm doing? Building a successful career is running away. When it comes at the cost of everything else, yes. Linda stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Please, both of you. But Sarah was already on her feet, her napkin falling forgotten to the floor. Everything else? You mean at the cost of being the perfect girlfriend who sits quietly at family dinners? Who turns down promotions to keep her boyfriend's ego intact? Sarah, Linda gasped. That's not what James started. No, let me finish. Sarah's voice had taken on a sharp edge she'd never used in this house before. For 3 years, I tried to balance everything. My career, your family, your expectations. And you know what I've realized? The dining room had gone completely still. Rebecca was gripping her husband's hand. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear under the table. But Sarah couldn't stop now. All the frustration, all the resentment of the past months came pouring out. I've realized that I don't even need you. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back. Sarah continued, her voice shaking but clear. I don't need your approval, your family's approval, or your permission to succeed. I don't need any of it. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint voices of children playing in the other room. James didn't shout. He didn't argue back. Instead, he simply nodded once, his face unnaturally calm. Without a word, he stood up, placed his napkin carefully on the table, and walked out of the dining room. Seconds later, they heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of his car starting. Sarah stood frozen, the full weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. She looked around the table, at Linda's shocked face, at Robert's deep frown, at Rebecca's tears, at Michael's averted eyes, at Amy's obvious discomfort. The perfect Thanksgiving turkey sat cooling in the center of the table. The cranberry sauce had formed a skin. The green beans had gone cold. And Sarah, still standing, realized she had just destroyed 3 years of relationship in front of the entire family, with words she could never take back. The sound of James's car faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence heavier than any words could fill. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The sound of James's car had long faded, but its absence seemed to echo through the house. Sarah remained standing, her legs trembling slightly beneath her dress as the reality of what had just happened settled over the dining room like a heavy blanket. Linda was the first to break the silence. I'll get some coffee, she said, her voice unsteady as she rose from her chair. Her hands shook as she gathered a few plates, more for something to do than any real intention of cleaning up. Mom, let me help, Rebecca offered, quickly standing. She gave Sarah a look that contained both sympathy and disappointment, the kind of look that hurt worse than anger would have. Sarah slowly sank back into her chair, feeling the eyes of the remaining family members on her. Robert cleared his throat and stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. I think I'll check on the kids, he mumbled, heading toward the living room. Michael and Amy followed suit, leaving Sarah alone at the massive dining table. From the kitchen, she could hear the soft murmur of voices, Linda and Rebecca talking in hushed tones. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its familiar sound now seeming oddly out of place. Through the window, Sarah could see the last traces of daylight fading, and with it, any hope that this was just a bad dream. Her phone sat next to her plate, silent and dark. Part of her wanted to grab it, to call James, to take back everything she'd said, but another part, the part that had been building up frustration for months, kept her hand still in her lap. Rebecca returned first, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of Sarah without a word, then sat down beside her. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the steam rising from their cups like ghost stories untold. "He left me here," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He actually just left." Rebecca sighed, wrapping her hands around her mug. "What did you expect him to do, Sarah, after what you said?" In the kitchen, Sarah could hear Linda talking quietly on the phone, probably calling James, trying to make sure he was okay. The thought made her stomach twist. "I didn't." Sarah started, then stopped. "I never meant for this to happen. Not like this. Not here." "But it did happen," Rebecca said gently. "And now you have to decide what to do next." The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was stranded at her boyfriend's, possibly ex-boyfriend's, family home on Thanksgiving after having essentially nuked their relationship in front of everyone. Her apartment was across town, and the thought of calling a rideshare felt both practical and unbearably sad. Linda returned to the dining room, her phone clutched in her hand. "He's at Michael's apartment," she announced to no one in particular. He's safe." The unspoken worry in her voice made Sarah's chest tighten. "I should go," Sarah said, standing up abruptly. "I'll call a car." "Don't be silly," Linda replied, though her usual warmth was strained. "Tom can drive you home, right, Tom?" She looked at Rebecca's husband, who had just walked back in. "Of course," Tom answered, clearly relieved to have something useful to do. "Just let me get my keys." As Sarah gathered her things, her purse, her phone, her dignity, she felt Linda's hand on her arm. The older woman's eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Whatever happens between you and James, you know you can always call me, right?" The kindness in Linda's voice was almost worse than anger would have been. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and quickly turned away. The drive home with Tom was silent. He didn't try to make conversation, and Sarah was grateful for that. She watched the holiday decorations blur past her window, each twinkling light seeming to mock the disaster she'd left behind. When they pulled up to her apartment building, Tom simply said, "Take care, Sarah." It sounded like goodbye, and maybe it was. Sarah walked up to her apartment alone, her heels clicking on the stairs like a countdown. Each step reminded her of James's nod, his silence, the sound of his car starting. By the time she reached her door, she realized she was still carrying her phone, still waiting for it to light up with his name. It remained dark in her hand, as silent as the empty apartment that waited for her. Sarah woke up the next morning on her couch, still wearing her Thanksgiving dress. Her phone lay dead on the coffee table. She hadn't bothered to charge it after getting home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, inappropriately cheerful for how she felt. As she plugged in her phone, the screen lit up with notifications. 3 missed calls from Linda, 2 from Rebecca, and several text messages from various members of James's family. None from James himself. The memory of last night played in her mind like a bad movie she couldn't turn off. Each scene was crystal clear. The tense dinner, the argument, her final declaration, and James's quiet exit. She could still see Linda's face, filled with shock and disappointment. Her phone buzzed to life with a new message. It was from Rebecca. "Just checking if you're okay. Mom's worried. Call any of us if you need anything." Sarah stared at the message, her throat tight. Even after everything, they were still reaching out to her. She typed and deleted several responses before finally sending a simple, "I'm okay, thank you." Moving to her bedroom, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a mess, and her burgundy dress was wrinkled beyond repair. But it was her eyes that stopped her. They looked different somehow, like she'd aged years in a single night. The sound of her laptop chiming with a work email brought her back to reality. Friday. It was still a workday, Thanksgiving drama or not. She had a morning meeting she couldn't miss, even if her personal life was in shambles. As she showered and dressed for work, Sarah tried to focus on practical matters. She needed to book her flights for the Chicago trip. She had presentations to prepare, client meetings to schedule, but every mundane task seemed to echo with James's words about her priorities. Her Uber driver to work was chatty, sharing stories about his own Thanksgiving drama. Sarah barely heard him, lost in her own thoughts. Had she really meant what she said? Did she truly not need James? The words had felt powerful in the moment, but now they sat heavy in her stomach like undercooked turkey. At the office, Sarah was grateful it was a quiet day. Most people had taken the long weekend, leaving the space eerily empty. She sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, trying to focus on a report that suddenly seemed meaningless. Around noon, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Linda. "Sarah, dear. I know things are difficult right now, but I want you to know that James is safe. He's staying with Michael for a few days. I'm not taking sides here, but I think you both need some time to think. Please take care of yourself." The message was so typically Linda, caring and diplomatic, even in the midst of family crisis. Sarah found herself crying at her desk, quiet tears falling onto her keyboard. Her office phone rang, startling her. It was her boss, calling to congratulate her on landing the Singapore project. "This is huge for your career trajectory," he said enthusiastically. "The sky's the limit now." Once, those words would have filled her with pride and excitement. Now they just reminded her of everything she might have lost. She thought about all the times she'd chosen work over family events, all the times she prioritized her career over her relationship. Had she really been running away, like James said? Looking around her office, Sarah saw it with new eyes. The awards on her wall, the view from her corner office, the nameplate declaring her new title, all the things she'd fought so hard for. They were real achievements, ones she'd earned through hard work and dedication. But for the first time, she wondered about the cost. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from Rebecca. "Whatever happens with you and James, remember you're still family to some of us. When you're ready to talk, I'm here." Sarah sat back in her chair, the weight of reality finally settling in. She had stood in front of the people who had welcomed her into their family for 3 years and declared she didn't need them. She had watched the man she loved walk away without a word. And now, in the cold light of day, she had to face the question she'd been avoiding. Was her independence worth the price of her isolation? The answer, she was beginning to realize, wasn't as clear as it had seemed last night. 7 days passed like molasses. Sarah threw herself into work, staying late at the office each night, trying to fill the silence with the sound of keyboard clicks and client calls. Her apartment felt too empty, too quiet, with only the hum of the refrigerator to keep her company. James hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't emailed. His silence spoke volumes, and Sarah found herself jumping every time her phone buzzed, only to feel her heart sink when it wasn't him. On Sunday evening, Sarah sat on her couch with a glass of wine, staring at their last photo together on her phone. It was from just 2 months ago, at a friend's wedding. They were both smiling, his arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. The picture felt like it was taken in another lifetime. "You're pathetic," she muttered to herself, closing the photo app, but she couldn't delete the picture. Not yet. Her work calendar reminded her of the upcoming Chicago trip, 3 weeks away from Boston, away from the mess she created. Part of her was relieved, while another part felt like she was proving James right about running away. Linda had sent daily text messages, each one gentle and caring. "Made too much lasagna. The freezer's full if you want some. The garden club misses you. Just checking in, dear." Sarah hadn't responded to any of them. What could she say? "Sorry I blew up your family Thanksgiving? Sorry I broke your son's heart in front of everyone." Through Rebecca, she learned that James was still staying at Michael's apartment. He'd gone to work, was eating regularly, seemed okay. The word felt inadequate. How could either of them be okay after what happened? On Wednesday night, Sarah finally broke down and called her sister Kate. "I really messed up," she said as soon as Kate answered. "Yeah, you did," Kate agreed, never one to sugarcoat things. "But maybe it needed to happen." "What do you mean?" "Sarah, you've been unhappy for months. Both of you have. Sometimes things need to break completely before they can be fixed, if they're meant to be fixed at all." The words hit home. Sarah thought about the months of tension, the passive-aggressive comments, the growing distance between them. Had they been heading toward this explosion all along? At work, Sarah's success continued to grow. The Singapore project was moving forward, her team was expanding, and her boss was talking about another promotion. Everything she worked for was falling into place, so why did it feel so hollow? On Friday night, exactly a week after Thanksgiving, Sarah found herself driving past James' apartment building. The lights were off, of course they were, he wasn't there. She pulled into the parking lot anyway, sitting in her car and staring at the dark windows. Her phone buzzed. Rebecca again. "He's asking about you, not directly, but he is." Just thought you should know. Sarah typed back, "Is he okay?" Three dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "He's like you, pretending to be fine." That night, Sarah lay in bed, thinking about what she'd said at Thanksgiving. "I don't even need you." The words had felt powerful then, a declaration of independence. Now they just felt like a shield she'd been hiding behind. The truth was messier than either complete dependence or total independence. She didn't need James. She'd proven she could succeed on her own. But wanting someone in your life wasn't the same as needing them. Had she confused the two? As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last thought was of James's quiet nod before he left. He hadn't argued, hadn't tried to prove she was wrong. He just accepted her words and walked away. Maybe he'd been feeling the same way, not needed, not essential, just convenient. The silence stretched between them like a wall, built brick by brick with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Sarah wondered if there were enough words left in either of them to break it down. 10 days after Thanksgiving, Sarah found herself sitting in her therapist, Dr. Chen's office, finally ready to talk about what happened. The comfortable leather chair felt less welcoming than usual as she recounted the disastrous dinner. "And you truly believe you don't need him?" Dr. Chen asked, her expression neutral but curious. Sarah opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it again. The question wasn't as simple as it had seemed that night. "I can survive without him," she finally said. "I can be successful without him. But surviving isn't the same as living," Dr. Chen finished gently. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. She thought about her empty apartment, her long hours at work, the promotion that felt increasingly hollow. Success was supposed to feel better than this. Meanwhile, across town, James sat in his brother Michael's living room, nursing a beer and trying to make sense of his own feelings. Michael sat across from him, unusually serious. "You know what your problem is?" Michael said, setting down his own beer. "You're so worried about Sarah not needing you that you forgot to ask yourself if that's actually a bad thing." James looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "Look, man, Mom and Dad's generation, they had this whole dependency thing going on. But maybe not needing each other isn't the worst foundation for a relationship. Maybe it's better than needing someone so much you can't stand on your own." The thought stayed with James as he lay on Michael's couch that night, staring at the ceiling. He'd been so focused on feeling replaced by Sarah's career that he hadn't considered whether his own insecurities were part of the problem. Back in her office, Sarah was having lunch with her colleague Marie, who had witnessed the whole evolution of her relationship with James. "Remember when you first started dating him?" Marie asked, picking at her salad. "You were so worried about maintaining your independence that you almost didn't give him a chance." Sarah remembered. She'd been burned before by relationships where she'd lost herself, where her ambitions had been seen as threats. And then, Marie continued, "You finally let your guard down. You were happy. What changed?" "I did," Sarah realized. "When the promotion started coming, when my career really took off, I put the walls back up. I started proving I didn't need him before he had a chance to resent me for succeeding." "Did he ever actually resent your success?" Sarah thought about it. James had always celebrated her promotions, had bragged about her accomplishments to his friends. It wasn't until she started pulling away that he became critical of her work hours and travel schedule. That evening, James met his father for dinner. Robert waited until they'd ordered before bringing up the elephant in the room. "Your mother's worried about you," he said. "We all are." James stirred his coffee absently. "I'm fine, Dad." "No, you're not. And that's okay." Robert leaned forward. "But let me ask you something. Are you more upset that Sarah said she doesn't need you, or that you're realizing you might not need her either?" The question caught James off guard. He'd been so focused on Sarah's words that he hadn't examined his own feelings of independence. As the week drew to a close, both Sarah and James found themselves reaching similar conclusions through different paths. Their friends and family had held up mirrors, showing them truths they'd been avoiding. Sarah realized that her fierce independence had become a weapon she wielded before anyone could hurt her. James understood that his desire to be needed had blinded him to the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one built on want rather than need. The distance between them remained, but something had shifted. The anger had faded, replaced by understanding. They had both been fighting old battles, defending against hurts that hadn't actually materialized. The question now wasn't whether they needed each other. The question was whether they wanted to choose each other, freely and independently, knowing they could survive apart, but might thrive together. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Sarah sat at a small coffee shop downtown, her hands wrapped around a warm latte. She'd chosen this place because it was neutral territory, not their usual coffee spot, not near either of their workplaces. Through the window, she watched James approach, his familiar walk making her heart skip despite everything. He looked tired but composed as he entered, ordering his usual black coffee before joining her at the table. For a moment, neither spoke, the buzz of the cafe filling the space between them. "You look well," he said finally, though his eyes noted the dark circles under hers that matched his own. "So do you," she replied, both knowing they were being polite. "Michael's couch must be comfortable." A slight smile touched his lips. "About as comfortable as your office, where I hear you've been sleeping most nights." Of course he'd heard. Their worlds were too interconnected to truly separate, even after everything that had happened. "James, she started. "Sarah," he began simultaneously. They both stopped, shared a small laugh that felt like the first genuine moment between them in weeks. "You first," he offered. Sarah took a deep breath. "I meant what I said that night," she began, watching his face tighten slightly, but not in the way it came out. "I don't need you, and you don't need me, and maybe that's okay." He sat back, studying her face. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about the difference between needing someone and wanting them in your life, between dependency and choice." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My career is important to me. That won't change. And yes, I can be successful without you. But these past 2 weeks, being successful doesn't mean much when you don't have someone to share it with." James nodded slowly. "I've been doing some thinking too. Why your independence scared me so much. About why I turned every business trip into a personal rejection. And," she prompted softly, "and I realized I was trying to be necessary instead of trying to be partners. I wanted to be needed because I thought that was safer than being chosen." The morning crowd bustled around them, oblivious to the quiet revelations being shared at their small table. Sarah's coffee had gone cold, untouched. "So where does that leave us?" she asked. James leaned forward, his voice serious. "I can't promise I won't worry when you're traveling. I can't promise I won't miss you at family dinners. And I can't promise I'll always be able to put personal life before work," Sarah responded. "I can't promise I'll never have to take another last-minute business trip." "I know," he said. "But maybe we stop trying to prove we don't need each other and start focusing on why we want to be together." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Your family probably hates me now." James actually laughed at that. "Are you kidding? Mom has been calling me daily to make sure I'm not throwing away something special because of my ego." Her words, not mine. A weight Sarah hadn't realized she was carrying lifted slightly. "So what now?" "Now," James said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "we start over. Not as people who need each other to survive, but as people who choose each other every day, who support each other's dreams instead of feeling threatened by them. Even if those dreams take me to Singapore?" she asked, half joking, half serious. "Even then, as long as you choose to come back." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked across the table, both understanding that this wasn't an ending or a beginning, but a transformation. "We should probably get back to work," Sarah said eventually. "Probably," James agreed. "Dinner tonight? We can talk more?" Sarah smiled, genuine and warm. "I'd like that. And James, I may not need you, but I do love you." "I love you too," he replied, standing. "Exactly as you are. Successful career, independent spirit, and all." They walked out of the coffee shop together, not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's presence. The morning sun caught the frost on the trees, making them sparkle like new beginnings. Sometimes, they both realized, the strongest relationships aren't built on need at all, but on the daily choice to stay, to grow, and to love, independently together.